acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay tribute to their history, their culture and their ongoing contribution to our communities. We really appreciate that we're able to meet with you today. We feel that it's very important that we hear from the Tamil community directly.
I used to work for Amnesty International and is involved in various other community organisations. And the issue that made me first get politically active in terms of through the Greens was in 2001 when John Howard was Prime Minister and he stood up and said, "We will decide who will come into this country and the circumstances of which they come." The fact is that we now have Labor and Liberal, the leadership of both those parties, spruiking the same policy that is denying people their rights, denying Australia's obligations and wanting to use the lives of vulnerable people to score political points. And I'm really, really sorry to those of you in the Tamil community that you are having to see this happen.
Thank you.
While appreciating what you're doing to address the refugee issues, with or without the elections, the refugees will always be used as a football in politics. I think it will be good if your party could impress on the government to actually look at the real reasons for these refugees heading in droves towards Australia. As you said, the current government and the Liberal Party stood silent while the Tamils were being slaughtered. There's no reason why we can't ask them now to speak now and address the real issues. And I'd like to know if Greens would like to take that as an option to address the real reasons for the refugee issues.
In terms of the conflict in Sri Lanka and the awful crimes that have been committed against humanity there is obviously a call at the moment for a war crimes investigation. And next week when the Senate goes back, I'll be moving a motion calling on the government to support that call to the United Nations for a war crimes investigation. It's really important that a country like Australia stands up and acknowledges what happened.
It's worth remembering actually, and this is a bit of our history, is that in the late 1970s and the 1980s, there were so many boat people coming to this country. But interestingly then, and we go from changes from a coalition government to a Labor government, it wasn't used as a political football. It was actually bipartisan under former Prime Ministers Fraser and Hawke. Now, Greens, we disagree with a lot that they did, but when you look on that period, they weren't taking advantage of the complexities when those people were arriving on our shores to actually sort of push buttons of Australians in terms of being racist, which is a sin, and to try and win elections off the back of that. So it has been different, and we've got to return to that period where you're looking at it in terms of compassion, not in terms of electoral advantage. So it's a really important point you make.
All you need to do is look at Villawood Detention Centre, where we have asylum seekers detained in the same facility that criminals are who are waiting deportation because they've broken their visa conditions because they actually have committed crime. They're not asylum seekers, they're not refugees, they're waiting deportation because they've done something wrong. And yet they are housed in the same facility as asylum seekers and refugees. That whole idea that it is illegal to seek asylum and somehow you are a criminal if you're an asylum seeker or refugee really needs to be challenged because it's not right. International law says it's not right. I think the reality is many members of Parliament, many members within the Federal Parliament press gallery don't actually understand what happened. They actually think this idea that the war is over means, oh, it's all peaceful and happy. They don't understand the numbers of people that are still left in concentration camps. They don't understand that people's entire towns and communities have been destroyed. The idea that somehow the war ended in May and then everything's all right. There's no real concept that that's not the reality.
When refugees come here on boats or how they come here, they're already quite traumatised and quite distressed because they've gone through like unspeakable tragedies. Yet putting them in detention is just adding to the psychological problems of they're being treated like criminals. They're locked up in these barbed wire camps, which are just as bad as barbed wire camps back in Sri Lanka. So, what's the process there? What's going to happen? Like, they're going to need even more rehabilitation than they would have needed if they were just process.
We shouldn't be a country that allows children to be institutionalised to the extent where they are clinically pressed. It's just that is not what Australia's notion of a fair go is meant to be about. And yet and we've seen that. We're meant to have learned from that. The impact of detention on vulnerable people who are suffering torture and trauma is simply compounded, and they are still, I don't say that they are suffering post-traumatic stress, because they're actually still in the middle of it when they're in detention.
I understand in New Zealand that they have a policy where the asylum seekers largely live in the community while it's sorted out, and they're not. Do you understand that? And they're not actually put behind the barbed wire. Because your point's really spot on.
Yeah.
It used to be like that in Australia.
Yeah.
Well, our federal policy is very much a harm minimisation policy, and that we really need to be ensuring that people who are suffering from drug addiction are given the medical and health support that they need. And of course, anyone who's trafficking drugs needs to be dealt with through criminal sanctions. But that drug users themselves, actually, we really need to be putting in place health programs to deal with that.
As Sarah's outlined, it's about policies about saving lives. It's not about increasing drug use at all. That's been a terrible misconception that's been deliberately driven by Labor and the coalition parties.
Yeah, I think the right government during the war, and even now the way it's treating the Tamil community, is doing this because they don't think the Tamil community is important enough for them. They wouldn't have done this, for example, to the Jewish community, because we just, they don't think we're a threat to the right Labor government. And even the processing asylum seekers from Sri Lanka, once again, it's because we're not a threat to them. So I think we've got a really good opportunity here with the federal election coming up to unite as a community and show that we actually do have a voice, and that we are, they need to listen to us, and they can't keep doing this to our community. However, if, for example, 40,000 Tamils do go and vote for not Labor or Liberal and maybe for the Greens, there is a we don't, as a community, I guess, we're probably not really aware of the preferential voting system. So we would maybe be scared. A few people might say, but if we don't vote Labor, does that mean Liberals going to get in? So I think there's a really good opportunity for the Greens to try and explain to the Tamil community what preferential voting is, and if you actually do vote for the Greens, what that means, like what's the political power in the upcoming federal election. I think that's really important if you want to get the Tamil community vote.
Look, we really appreciate the question, and again, we'd be interested in exploring it with you further. Is remember that in Australia, when you go and vote, you can allocate preferences. So we would obviously hope that you would vote one Greens, and then you can preference the parties, the candidates of your choice. And if the Greens are not elected, your vote will then flow through to elect who you give your next preference or further down the track. Now, that's something, Brahmi's question is really very relevant to how the next election will play out. I would hope that, and you can see the extensive work that Sarah's doing on Tamil issues, that if we have more Greens in the Senate, and there is a chance that there will be balance of power, that we have more voice on these important issues in the Senate. So a vote for the Greens in the Senate can put us into the Senate. A big thank you to everybody. Your comments and insights are very helpful for our day-to-day work, and particularly in helping to strengthen the Greens' voice on bringing forward progressive, decent, humane asylum seeker policies and getting